Hope you enjoy it. Chapter 54 Dogs. Tinker and Charlie were disturbed by the loud barking of a dog. It was pulling on its lead and it looked like it was getting out of hand. The owner was an elderly lady with a very red face, and it looked like the dog was taking her for a walk rather than the other way around. Suddenly the dog shook free from the lead and it sped towards the slurry pond, as if its life depended on it. It's not going to stop, said Charlie, and the dog ploughed straight into the slurry with wild eyes and its long tongue hanging out and dripping with saliva. Help us, shouted the lady as the dog sank slowly, and soon it was no longer wagging and the dog's eyes were bright with fear. What do we do? Said Charlie, and he twiddled with his thumbs nervously. I'm not sure, said Tinker, but I'll think of something, he said. Charlie wished that Spider-Man was here now to help them, as the poor old lady cried out, and the now silent dog sank further into the quagmire inch by inch, and each pitiful bark pierced Charlie's heart, and he felt that he had to act. We have to do something, he said, and he was terrified that the poor dog would just disappear under the dirt and oily slime. It was a terrible way to go. I'm going in, said Tinker to Charlie, and the old lady's amazement. Charlie stared as Tinker took off his coat, and then he boldly or foolishly waded into the slimy slurry. He grabbed the trolley for balance, and he moved so slowly and carefully like a mummy. The dog's paws were scratching at the surface as if it was propelled, but the only thing that happened was that the dog sank even further down, and it raised its poor head above the cold slurry and stared at the safe blue sky in wonder. Charlie watched open-mouthed as Tinker waded waist-deep into the horrible slime, and he was terrified that he was going to sink under like a stone. The dog slipped further and it held its head higher. The owner started to cry. It was obvious that she thought she would never see her beloved dog again. And Charlie was beginning to have his doubts too. Tinker was now up to his waist and he could feel the slurry sucking at him. It was like he was in the tentacles of a giant octopus. Tinker was smart and he knew of the risks. He had carefully balanced his feet on the trail of debris from abandoned tires to rusty bicycles. Everything had been thrown in there. Luckily for Tinker, it was keeping him afloat and out of danger. But neither Charlie nor the old lady were any the wiser, and they were lost in dark, ominous thoughts. Charlie began to panic inside as the dog slipped further under, and Tinker seemed too far away to do. He began to daydream, and it was the only way that he could cope with the stress and rising within him like a volcano. The barking of the dog and the grey surroundings disappeared as once again Spider-Man sprung back into action. He wasn't fazed by the mud, and he glided across the surface like a ballerina, and he was too quick to sink. It was as if he was on an ice rink. Next page coming up. Spider-Man gently pulled the dog free with a loud plop, as if a cork had been finally separated from an old bottle of wine. Spider-Man was his alter ego. Charlie smiled in admiration, and then he was quickly brought back down to earth when Tinker shouted his name, and then he threw a slimy rope his way. Charlie wasn't too keen on grabbing it, and he winced as his hands curled around the impossibly sticky rope. It was thick with brown mud, as sticky as a wedding cake. Tinker had somehow tied the rope to the dog's collar, and he was walking backwards slowly and pulling the mewing dog out of the slippy sludge. Charlie reluctantly pulled the rope, trying not to gasp at the coldness of his hands. Hello, viewers. He could see the relieved-looking dog coming towards him, as if on a slow-motion elevator. Pull, Tinker shouted so loudly to wake the heavens, and the poor lady's dog owner was hopping about from one foot to the other in anticipation, but at least she was smiling, thought Charlie. Finally the dog was free, and it bounded towards its owner as if nothing bad had happened. Tinker was smiling even though he was covered in grey sludge and slime, and it drifted off him like porridge. I think it's time we went home, said Charlie, and Tinker didn't even have to answer. Chapter 55, Home. Tinker looked down at his extremely grey trousers and his heart sank. He knew that he would be in trouble when his dad saw the state they were in. His dad was always complaining about how much he had spent on his son's clothing and even school uniforms. Tinker felt that he was a burden, and he brushed the ash off his trousers as he walked, but it was of no use. They were uncleanable. Charlie didn't say much. He was embarrassed that he hadn't waded into the slurry. He had wanted to, but he was afraid, and he looked down at his hands and he could see that they were red with the burning of the rope. He felt incredibly tired, dog-tired, he thought to himself, and he couldn't help but smile. I'm glad that the dog got out safe, he said to Tinker before they parted on the usual street corner. Me too, said Tinker. See you tomorrow, he said, and he went home to face the consequences. Tinker closed the door as quietly as possible, and he crept upwards as silent as a thief. Hello, viewers. He looked down, and to his horror the hardened clay was falling from his trousers like crumbling confetti, and he wanted to make it to the usual safety of his bedroom, but they crumpled onto the carpet. Just before his dad saw the state of his expensive ruined trousers and the peppered carpet. His dad hated waste, and he especially hated wasting money, as it was money that he could have spent on himself. To him, cigarette and booze were much more important than anything Tinker needed. He couldn't wait for him to go out and earn a living, so that he could give most of it to him, and then his dad would have even more money for booze and fags. No matter how carefully Tinker stepped, the stairs creaked like an old piano, and it was only a matter of time before his dad caught up with him and demanded an explanation. Halfway up the stairs, it happened. Hello, viewers, I hope you can hear me. Turning the next page. Charlie Buck. Where do you think you are going so sneakily? His dad said with a drink already in his hand. Oh, I'm tired, said Tinker. I need to lay down. You're not going anywhere, he said angrily, surveying the state of his clothes and the mess on the carpet. It looked just like a Jackson Pollock. What the hell's this? He shouted, and before he could answer, he had grabbed Tinker tightly by his black hair, and he had his face down in the mud-splattered carpet. Tinker couldn't breathe. All that went into his nostrils was the sewer-like smell of the slurry, which covered the brand-new carpet, and still fell from his ruined school trousers, no matter how much he didn't want it to. He wanted to get up, but he couldn't, and finally his dad relented, and Tinker lifted his head up to take a much-needed breather. He only had a few seconds of peace before his dad came back with a cloth and bucket. Clean it up, he shouted into Tinker's bruised, red and sweaty face. The smell on his dad's breath was almost as overpowering as the smell from the carpet. Tinker dipped the cloth into the ice-cold water, and he began to scrub at the ruined carpet. Tinker felt guilty at the state of his trousers, and he began to wonder if it was all his fault. That was until he was winded by a mighty punch to his sides, as he keeled over like a newborn lamb. He heard his dad say, "That will teach you for being so stupid." And then he walked away to the sloshing of the whiskey in his glass. That night, when he crept into bed, Tinker's sides were purple, and he rolled over slowly, and he wondered what kind of evening Charlie was having. I bet it's not as bad as mine, he thought sadly, and he couldn't stop the tears from falling. It was rare for him to cry, but he couldn't help himself. He wished his mum was here, but he knew that she would never come back. His dad had paid for that. He had driven her away with his drinking and his temper. Tinker held onto his pillow for comfort, and he wished that sleep would come quickly. His last thoughts were of Charlie, and he knew that he needed his friendship to survive, and he hoped vice versa. He never told Charlie about his troubles at home. As far as Charlie knew, he had the perfect home life. Hello viewers, hope you can hear me. I'm signing off now. I'll be reading more later.